And with that, we will transition to part 2 of our program, which will be an educational component. I'll turn it over to our police chief, who will walk us through some of the process the APD has. We'll go ahead and have our panelists go ahead and take a seat in the front row. And then after Chief Manley goes, then you'll hear from Margaret Moore. And then after that, we'll turn it over to you to ask whatever questions that you have for any of our panelists. So we'll go ahead and transition to the chief, and then we will come back up later.
Okay, I want to go over briefly what happens at the onset of a critical incident. And for the Austin Police Department, a critical incident mostly are going to be our officer-involved shootings or those instances that create an injury that could result in serious bodily injury or death. But mostly these are going to be the officer-involved shootings. The response that we have is that we've got a couple of different types of investigations that occur. So when this instance occurs, the supervisor that's on the scene is going to take control of that scene and start ensuring that we get the appropriate investigative individuals and resources on the way so that we can contain that scene and begin to process it. There are also a multitude of phone calls and notifications that begin through the communications, the 911 center. We are making notifications immediately to the district attorney so that they can respond with the appropriate personnel. The police monitor's office is notified so that they can respond. And then within the department, we're notifying our internal affairs division along with our special investigations unit. And for those of you that may not know the difference, the internal affairs investigative unit is responsible for investigating policy violations. They're going to conduct an administrative investigation to determine whether or not whatever took place was compliant with policy. Our special investigation unit are investigators that are specialized in use of force investigations, and they're going to work on an investigation to determine whether or not the actions that took place at that instant were compliant with the law. And they will be conducting an investigation from that perspective. And I don't want to step too much on the presentation. You're about to get a much more thorough with slides and all I can see below me here from the district attorney on how they do theirs, but our investigation is conducted in alignment with the district attorney, so they are part of that investigation. So when we respond to the scene, the first thing that we're going to take control of is scene security. We want to make sure that we have secured that scene and that scene is safe for all of the individuals that are about to respond to process the scene, and also that the scene is safe for whatever neighborhood, part of the town, wherever this took place. Prior to us arriving, that being all of the investigative units that I just discussed, the supervisor on scene will take what we call a public safety statement from the involved officer or officers. And this statement is limited to a series of, I believe it is 10 questions that are specific to determine if that scene is safe. We will ask questions such as, are all of the individuals involved accounted for? Because we need to know whether there is somebody that may still be out in the area or in the community that we have not yet found that may have been involved in this. Are all weapons that were involved in this that you know of accounted for? So we make sure that the scene is secure from that perspective. So the questions that are asked in the immediate aftermath of that officer are very very directed towards the safety of the scene. And then what will happen is the investigators will show up, the crime scene unit will show up, and we're going to begin processing that scene to secure the evidence. The first things that we're going to do, we're going to video that scene. We're going to take photographs of that scene. We want to document everything as it is before we start having other individuals walk through the scene. We want to capture everything so that both the administrative and the criminal investigations can be conducted with full advantage of all of the evidence that's present. Internally, what we do is the investigation on scene will be conducted by both branches, both the criminal and the administrative. But we focus on having, once the case goes back to the offices and the investigation takes place in the coming weeks, The criminal through the Special Investigations Unit takes place first. We're going to have that officer come in. We're going to interview that officer. We're going to interview witnesses, and we're going to work through the SIU process. An officer that's involved in a critical incident maintains the same rights as any other citizen as far as whether or not they want to cooperate with that investigation, because that investigation is criminal in nature, and they have the right to invoke the same rights to give a statement or to not give a statement. So that's what takes place during that investigation. An internal affairs investigation, on the other hand, is an administrative investigation being conducted at the order of the chief, and they are therefore required to participate in that investigation. So at some point or another, officers will be giving an account. I will say that although it doesn't happen in every instance, in almost every instance, the officers are more than willing to come forward, more than willing to give a statement, and often at the scene of the incident, we will do a walkthrough. Once we have handled all of the processing of the scene, we have photographed, we have videotaped, we have collected the relevant evidence that would possibly be disturbed by anybody entering the scene, we will ask the officer to do a walkthrough. And the walkthrough is done on video and audio tape. So we are recording this entire event, and it will be the officer, their attorney can be present with them. The district attorney's office will be there. I myself do the walkthrough along with a member of my executive team, depending upon whose officer it is. That chief will be there. We will have investigators from the Special Investigations Unit paying attention to this. And again, it's all to capture an immediate understanding of what happened. And that officer will give us a verbal description of what occurred in that incident, beginning with what they were dispatched to, what it was like when they got there, the actions that they encountered, the actions that they took. And again, this is all recorded on video. And as you know, in an attempt to put out as much information as possible, as soon as possible, we do give briefings to the media in the hours after a shooting. And I rely on that walkthrough to get the information that we then use to give a media briefing. And so that's why sometimes it takes several hours, because if it's a larger scene, we have to process it to get that information to give that statement. So at the scene, we're going to get a statement from the public safety perspective to ensure that the scene is secure. And then we will likely get a statement that's done through the walkthrough process that, again, that is recorded and that is available for use in the upcoming investigation. The investigators, then both the criminal and the administrative investigators, are there. The district attorney's office is there, and we work through the processing of that scene. And then ultimately witnesses are brought back, statements are taken. And at that point, it's investigated just like any other case that we might respond to as far as what takes place on the scene, and then of course the follow-up investigation. So we bring the resources out, we conduct, like I said, a twofold investigation, both criminal and administrative, and it is all done with the police monitors present. And I should have mentioned the police monitor is available at the walkthrough, and for those of you who don't know it, Devin Desai is our police monitor, and he is here tonight as well. The investigation, once it moves over to the administrative side of the house within the police department, the police monitor's office has oversight of that investigation. They sit in on all of the interviews that take place with witness officers or the subject officer. The police monitor, we have a civilian review panel here in Austin, which is a group of citizens. The critical incidents are presented to the Citizens Review Panel, so they get a presentation, full presentation once the investigation is complete on everything that occurred in that critical incident, and then they have the authority and the ability to write a letter and to make a recommendation to me prior to me rendering a decision on that critical incident on whether or not it was within or not within policy, and then any recommendations they may have regarding that, training, tactics, equipment, things that might be a concern to them. So those are the two different types of investigations that are taking place on the scene of a critical incident, and they both have two different functions, administrative and criminal, and they both have other agencies alongside us monitoring our investigations and working with us, whether it be the police monitor's office on the administrative side or the district attorney's office on the criminal side. So I don't know that we want to, Vincent, if you want to do questions now or if you want the DA to give her presentation and then we do questions for both, I'll leave the format up to you on how you'd like to approach that.
If there are a couple questions now that someone wants to ask, that way we can take those and then we'll turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Gentleman that's had his hand up here for a little while.
The way that you were speaking, sir, I heard that it sounded like that you kind of like took a reform and order into adjusting the crime scene before you come out and speak about what happened. You kind of like saying that you're going to make sure everything's secured first, and you kind of like going to have your facts straight before you approach the media and speak about what happened in situations of police brutality. Am I right?
I'm talking about what happens at the scene of the investigation of a critical incident. And so just to be clear, what I was trying to explain was the first thing that's going to happen, notifications are being made, we're calling all the appropriate people to the scene. The actual officers and supervisors on the scene are going to take care of securing that scene. If it's one that needs to be, if we need to close streets, if we need to tape off a neighborhood, if we need to have neighbors get back while we secure it, all of those things are taking place while we're working on getting all the appropriate investigative units on the scene. Yes, ma'am.
I heard that you said that, for the most part, the criminal investigation is handled in the same way that any other incident of that type would be handled. But the main difference that I hear is that the only statement that has to be given is the initial public safety statement, and there may be a walkthrough. But I'm assuming that if a private citizen shoots someone, they're not going to be given the choice about what they're going to go home that night as where an officer would be. And doesn't that just create the impression that they're getting time to go home and work on their story? Why?
Sure. It's a fair question, and it does raise the ability for someone to bring that objection up. There are scientific studies on one side of that issue and scientific studies on the other. There are studies that say that, that officers involved in critical incidents such as this will have a better recall. I was at a major city chiefs conference 2 months back, and this was one of the things we talked about is there a better recall 2 days later? And the science behind it, is the recall better about the actual critical incident itself or peripheral issues around the shooting itself? So I accept the criticism and I understand it because yes, we do give the officers, normally it's 2 sleep cycles before they will come back and they will actually be interviewed on that. And it's based on what studies have shown in the past is effective. And so I accept your criticism that it is not always the same, obviously, in situations like this involving civilians. Civilians also still have that same opportunity to choose to give a statement or to not give a statement.
Well, we don't get a chance to fix our story with our friend. That's the complaint. You guys go home. You guys go home. You guys go home after you shoot us. And you go home and they pick up the phone and talk to their neighbor. They fix their story. And they talk to their sergeant and they fix their story. And they talk to the police union rep and they fix their story. And they got their lawyer and they fix their story. And usually after 2 sleep cycles, they're going to have better recall. But a citizen who stands accused for not even shooting a cop, but a citizen who stands accused after he's been beaten and falsely accused of false resisting arrest or ag assault on a police officer, he doesn't get the opportunity. When he goes to jail, he's in segregation for the first 24, 48 hours. He doesn't get to meet with his union rep. He doesn't get to talk to his mother or his father privately. You don't subpoena the phone calls, phone records. Why don't you guys tap the phone of the police officer who's accused? We gotta start taking some action, man. It's gonna get ugly. We gotta start taking some action. And it requires some leadership. And it's unfortunate, though, that we have this situation. But listen, there should be no super law protecting law enforcement. They should not be giving more privileges than the people they're supposed to serve. And that's our problem. It was fairly as comparable. I was arrested
To that,
The guy had the audacity, you know why? Because he is unassailable. You have to stop the bad behavior. There's enough examples of bad cops and bad cop behavior to make us believe that the community is comprised of poor behaving police officers. You gotta fix it. You gotta get it. You gotta nip it in the bud.
I'd like to meet with you after the meeting and get information on the incident you're talking about. We're absolutely willing to look into it as, again, that's the whole purpose of police oversight. That's the purpose of internal affairs. If you have an incident that you've,
He was on duty that night.
okay, but if you're saying it's the conduct of one of my officers, then it needs to be reported to the police department so that we can look at it.
I gave it to the magistrate because he is the legal authority at that point.
Chaz, you got a question?
About the crime scene, you know, like, we work together because I want to fix the police department because it's broken and it needs not reform, it needs fixing, it needs overhaul. But I want to go back to what he was saying because in this case with his brother that was shot by cops and managed to live, which doesn't happen in APB history when black people get shot by cops, they normally die. So when this guy was shot, So when he was shot, for whatever reason, you came out and said that his brother had shot at the cops. That was the initial story. I'm not saying that. You wrote that stuff somewhere in communication. And that crime scene, what got back to me was in the ring. And you came out, I think maybe a day later, 2 days later, and said that in fact was not the case. Now, I do applaud you for saying we messed up. However, that one mistake cost his brother a $500,000 bond. And he's still sitting in jail and he's not able to bond out because the story is, and the narrative still is, the one that's stuck, is that this guy shot at cops first. Right? So, and nothing has been done from any department in the city to correct that. So, if he didn't shoot at cops first or at all, because I didn't hear, like, I've never heard anybody say, including you, that he shot at them, why is this man still sitting in jail on a $500,000 bond where he has been, his hands have been amputated, he's on all kind of medicine, and he's not able to tell this story because he's in jail on a $500,000 bond. So I just want to know at what point in the process did that correction actually correct the problem?
Sure. So two different, and let me take that in two different parts. So as far as him still being in jail and the charges that are placed upon him, even though a shot may or may not have been fired, and I will touch on that in a moment, there is still a crime that was alleged to have been committed that night. Probable cause supporting that crime was presented to a judge, and a judge signed a warrant. So he is in jail under the charges related to that offense that was charged. And as we work towards being as transparent in the moment as possible and putting out information when we can, I stand here and tell you, we are going to get it wrong sometimes, and I will be the first to stand up when we do, and I've done it a couple of times. And in this instance, perception is what it is, and I will tell you that I had officers, there were multiple officers involved in that. There were officers that felt like they were fired upon. And so I will give you the best information that I can in the moment. And then if I understand that there's something that makes that information, if I believe that it is not accurate, I will be the first one to get out in front of it and to put out the accurate information. Again, I think that's the best we can do in an effort to be as transparent as possible, because in the alternative, if we can't have the ability to put out the best that we have and then correct it if we made a mistake, then we're put in a position where maybe we wait too long to put out information in an overabundance of caution, and I don't think that's where we want to be either. So that's exactly what happened in that circumstance. Is it ideal? No, but again, it's in our attempt to be as transparent as possible in the moment, putting out information to the community that absolutely has an interest and a desire to hear it.
Thank you, Chief Manley. If you can, please hold your questions. We're going to have some time for the end. But now it's time to transition to going to our district attorney to talk about her process to walk us through what happens after a use of force event occurs. So please hold your questions. We're going to have more time for questions right after this, but I'll turn it over to Margaret Moore.
Thanks. I want to thank Vincent and the Democratic Party for putting this together. We have quite a presentation for you, so I'm not going to take a whole lot of time introducing it, but I do want to introduce you to members of my staff. I have Dexter Guilford here. Dexter is director of our Civil Rights Division that includes the unit that looks at the officer-involved incidents and does those investigations with him, and our conviction integrity function, which is right now mostly involved in the process of looking at DNA cases to see if they need to be reviewed. So he has both of those. With him is Laurie Drimala. Laurie was chief of the critical incident unit that District Attorney Limburg had. I moved that unit out from under the chain of command it was in and put it in this separate unit, as I mentioned earlier. We have a presentation for you that will set forth in detail all of the changes we've made and the process that we're following. I do want to note that our county attorney, David Escamilla, is here, who has been a very helpful role player in our envisioning the best way that we can handle these cases and that our offices can work together in identifying particularly those cases where the use of force is less than lethal that they run across when they're looking at certain misdemeanor cases like resisting arrest, and they can refer them to us more smoothly. Also in the back there have an assistant DA, Leslie Booker. She's chief of one of our trial courts, Leslie, and is one of the loudest voices in my office for social justice and keeps me honest on. All right, Dexter, Laurie, I believe is going to start this.
Good evening. My name is Laurie Drimala, and I have been responding to critical incidences for the District Attorney's Office since May of 2011. Mother's Day, I think, it was the first one I responded to. And the way I became involved in officer-involved shooting was that I had been assigned to the white-collar unit after having been a trial court prosecutor for 14 years. And after a year in white-collar, I realized that I definitely needed to do something different. So I asked if I could start helping with officer-involved shootings, and the assistant DA at that time said, "Sure, you'll be on our next phone call." And a week later, I went out to my first officer-involved shooting. And I wanted to let you know that prosecutors want to prosecute crimes, and we want to see if there is a crime there. And as Margaret has instituted her new policies, that is our role, is seeing whether or not there's a crime there. And that starts with when we respond to an officer-involved shooting. So I want to take some time to go over, from our perspective, which is a little bit different than Chief Manley's, what an officer-involved shooting is from a prosecutor's perspective, what we see that night, the role that we play, and how we are there as citizens, as lawyers, and as prosecutors who are looking towards a possible criminal trial in the future. So as you know, Margaret introduced, it's myself, and Dexter Guilford is the director of our unit. We report directly to Margaret Moore. These are the type of cases that we work on. We work on officer-involved shootings, in custody deaths, use of force cases that involve non-lethal, and official misconduct. Those are the type of cases that come to our unit. Those are the type of cases that we review and decide whether or not they're ones that need to be presented to a grand jury. In terms of in-custody deaths, the only cases that we review are the ones where the medical examiner would rule a homicide. So when an officer-involved shooting happens, and I've been able to listen to and observe from the very beginning, when you start to hear the radio traffic, you hear just the word "shots fired." It doesn't say who fired the shots or who the shots were fired at. You hear "shots fired." And at that time, you hear all the different units saying that they're going to respond. So when we get to the scene, there are so many police cars you can't even imagine. The whole scene is lit up. All the different agencies are starting to arrive, and we are starting to assess where everything is. We get a hold of the lead detective for the Special Investigations Unit, and we begin our investigation at that time. And as you can see from the slide, all the different units that respond and Chief Manley went over this, internal affairs, city legal, the Office of the Police Monitor. They're at the scene and touching on what Chief Manley told us. The public safety statement is very important to us because that is what the officer is saying right after it occurred to his supervisor. That is the first clue to our office as to what occurred. There were times in the past that these were not recorded. We had a case that was high profile, and the officer had his knee near the microphone, so you couldn't hear the public safety statement. Now the officers are taken in the back of a patrol car and given that public safety statement. We have encouraged the Austin Police Department, other law enforcement agencies, make sure that that public safety statement gets recorded. Those are the very first words. And those are one of the things that we can do at the scene is emphasize that is what we want, and we want to hear it. If there is a case where we feel like, you know, this actually looks like it might be a crime, at the scene we can demand to listen to the public safety statement. We can ask to listen to the 911 calls right there while we're standing at the scene. Any evidence that we think is going to help us, we are able to, right at the scene, hear it right then. In terms of the walkthrough, that is a very important part as well because, again, it's happening right after the incident occurred. And that walkthrough is another clue to us to see, is this looking like it might possibly be a crime? And if so, we need to make sure that every single thing is being done. Even if it's not, it gives us a clue as to what we need to be concentrating on after the walkthrough. And during the walkthrough, if we feel like the detective who's asking the questions has not answered a question that we feel is important, then we are able to ask the detective to please ask the officer these questions. And these are usually taped, videotaped, and sometimes audio taped. The other policy that Margaret has instituted, which I think has been super helpful to us, is having an investigator from the DA's office go to the scene. As you all know, having another set of eyes on this investigation is very important. And when you have an investigator who's actually done this for a living, is a former police officer or has been investigating cases for a long period of time, they have a different perspective. Why aren't the officers doing this? Why haven't they found this piece of evidence? You need to make sure that this is done. And so I think having the investigators at the scene has been really beneficial to us. Sometimes it's late at night. You know, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and you know, we're all humans, and if you went to sleep at midnight and you get woken up at 2, it is nice to have an extra person there, which I think is one reason why when we get the call in the middle of the night, we might all 3 be there. And it might be silly for us to all 3 be there, but you know, hopefully 2 of the 3 of us are able to concentrate one brain. Lots of times we will stay there all night long. Sometimes one person will stay at the scene and watch the scene unfold, and then the other person will go down to the police station where they're interviewing witnesses. And as the witnesses are being interviewed and their statements are being typed up, we can sit there and read the witness statements and make sure that we feel like all the questions are being answered. We can call the person back at the scene and say, this witness said this witness said that, and that can help direct how the investigation proceeds at the scene. So I think we've gone over most of this. The purpose of us being at the scene, monitoring, advising, requesting. The press conference, Margaret's been able to be at most of the press conferences and stand behind the chief of police as he gives his press conference, and I think that gives us an added visibility because I think a lot of people didn't know, and Margaret's told me when she was on the campaign trail, people didn't really realize that we'd been going to the scenes since I think the 90s. But I knew in particular that myself, since May of 2011, I've been at every single one with the exception of maybe 3 or 4. So I was really surprised, actually I was shocked, when Margaret said that the public did not know we responded to the scene. The witness interviews and questioning, we went over that. We talked about being there present for the scene walkthrough. Sometimes it's super dark and it's hard to see things, so having the officer actually point out where things occurred, it helps us, it helps the crime scene, it helps the ballistics people who come in and try and recreate and do trajectories and find the shell casings and the projectiles. If we can't see, the fire department will come out there and light up the entire scene. And that is something that is really helpful as well. And we can be there to say, hey, we think that this particular area needs to be lit up. We need to see what's here. Can you please get the fire department out here? Can you please light it up? And Chief Manley touched on the fact that the crime scene is photographed, taped, tented, and then the officer does the walkthrough. Another thing that happens at the scene is that vehicular homicide arrives, and you see the diagram on the top right-hand corner. In each case, each officer involved shooting vehicular homicide comes out and draws the scene. So whenever we get a case ready for grand jury or trial, we have this drawing where every single piece of evidence is tented and measured, and we can call upon that later on when we're looking at the case and if we have questions that arise. Ballistics also responds to the crime scene. That's a firearm and tool mark examiner. They will come in, they will collect the evidence. Crime scene collects the evidence and they give it to the ballistics, and they take the weapons from the officers. They interview the officers about how the officer loads his weapon so they can determine how many shots were fired based on how the officer says that his firearm is loaded, which is important to be able to determine the number of shots that were fired at the time. So that's another interview that the officer has that takes place that night, is with the firearms examiner. Later on, there may be search warrants that are executed on vehicles. In this particular slide, you see there's a vehicle that has bullet holes in the windshield. If the ballistics expert is able to go take that vehicle back to the wrecker or the impound place and then reproduce trajectories to assist us in the investigation. I've been to Southside Wrecker and watched several vehicle search warrants be executed and watched them try and recreate how far away the officer was from the car, where the officer had to have been standing based on the way the trajectories were, and that's what those rods are. We assist after the fact. We attend a debrief. And that is usually about a week after the officer-involved shooting, where we come together again. We go over the witness statements, some of those that we've helped create the questions with. We go over search warrants and search warrant affidavits with the officers to help them draft those so that search warrants can be executed. And then at the debrief, all the same parties who were at the scene basically come together, and we go back over the case. A PowerPoint is presented, and at that time, any additional investigation that we think needs to be conducted, any additional evidence or search warrants or witness statements that need to be taken, we can request that those be done at that time. At this time, I'll turn over to Dexter Guilford.
Good evening. As you know, my name is Dexter Guilford. I am the director of the Civil Rights Unit. I want to thank you all for your invitation. It was one of the pillars of my vision when I accepted this position that Margaret shared, that one of the critical key components of any work that we were going to do would have to involve our periodic appearance before the community that we served, to submit ourselves to criticism, comment, questions, and as we built up a body of work, you would be able to hold us accountable to the standards that we profess. So I want to thank you all for your invitation. What I'd like to do is we'll start generally. I'd like to talk to you about some of the values that guide the policies that we have been developing and implementing. The first is that we want to ensure that all of the work we do is transparent, that all of the policies that we operate according to are available to you. We're in the final stages now of revising and editing our policies and our protocols and procedures, and they will be available for the public on our website. But is a critical component of our policy that it be transparent. In addition to publishing our protocols, policies, and procedures, as we'll discuss shortly, was the idea that any cases that we declined to go to the grand jury, to present to the grand jury, that we would issue a written declination letter explaining our decision. And the idea was that helped keep us accountable. It helped allow any public forums that we attended, it would allow you to have a basis on which to question the work that we were doing. Accountability. Accountability means not only are we accountable to you all for the work that we're charged to do, but as has been mentioned earlier, because we are prosecutors, it is to hold those accountable who we believe have committed a crime. So momentarily I'll talk to you about some of the things we've implemented to be more effective in that respect, because we all know that accountability, holding officers accountable that should be prosecuted, is difficult. So I'll talk to you about some of the things that we're implementing, some of the things we're doing to address that. Consistency. This goes back to the policies and procedures that we will be publishing. Those policies and procedures are going to guide our decision-making process. They will ground any decision that we make in any declination letters that we issue. You will be able to determine whether or not we've exercised fidelity to our policies and procedures. Independence. District Attorney Moore has already mentioned to you all that the first thing that she did was made our unit independent of the trial division. That has two reasons, two purposes. One has to do with the actuality of working closely with law enforcement in the trial courts, the possibility of bias and that sort of thing, but also the perception. Again, public trust and confidence being one of the key goals that we seek to engender. The appearance is as important as the actuality of the appearance of impartiality. One of the things that we want to do is work diligently, talking to other officers across the country that have been able to indict officers that had committed, where there was probable cause to believe a crime had been committed, those officers to find out the best practices. What have they been doing? What do they think they've done wrong? That is, we can start a conversation nationally with other DA's offices and try to come up with some idea about how we can be more effective in performing our core prosecutorial functions. Engagement with community partners. There are many of you all in the community. I've only been back in Austin for 7 months, and there are many of you all in this audience who I've already formed meaningful relationships with, both from traditional and organized civil rights and other community activist organizations, but individuals as well. Again, that's one of the key components of the work that we are doing in our unit. One of the things that we've done that I don't believe any other district attorney's office in the state is doing is we've instituted a formal program by which we bring the families in of individuals who've lost a loved one in an officer-involved shooting, and we share with them. Once we've made a decision not to take the case to the grand jury, we share with them the entirety of our investigative file. We've opened that to families who have also employed attorneys, and they've come in. We've had several of them come in, and we've shared that information with them. And the idea was many of these families had lost loved ones and did not know some of the basic facts about what had happened. We had families under the mistaken belief that their son or daughter had been shot 4 or 5 times, only to find out that there was 3 shots and the other 2 exit wounds because they had to find out from a mortician. So we've instituted a formal policy. Once we've made a decision not to prosecute the case, that we bring the family in, and even if they have an attorney, they're welcome to come as well, and we show them our entire file. Let's talk about some of the challenges that face units such as ours. I mentioned core prosecutorial function. A core prosecutorial function involves the ability to prosecute successfully those cases in which the evidence indicates a crime has been committed. We all know that in the case of officer-involved shootings, prosecutors don't even get out of the gate on the first core prosecutorial function. That is, cases that ought to be indicted don't get indicted. When they are indicted, they don't get convictions. That's a key challenge for any unit such as ours, and we are devoting our attention and our resources to trying to find out how we can implement best practices and do a better job of meeting those functions. Secondary prosecutorial functions. We are in a unique position insofar as we get information and feedback from law enforcement, families of those who've had loved ones who have been shot and killed or injured. We're in a unique position to have contact with both of those parties. Those parties rarely have an opportunity to share information with one another. Through our family outreach efforts, we're in the process now of trying to figure out how we can catalog citizen and family concerns and find a means by which we can forward them to Chief Manley and the police department, legitimate questions about policy, tactics, training, and equipment, and be a conduit so that families' questions can be addressed, their concerns can be addressed. We want to facilitate interagency collaboration on these cases. We have two other law enforcement agencies in this county. We are developing relationships with Police Department, APD, Travis County Sheriff's Office, and these relations up to this point, I've been here 7 months, and we've had seven officer involved shootings, and up to this point, we've had unfettered access to the crime scene at the time of the incident, as well as the investigation until the time that it's been complete. Those are the kind of relationships that we want to continue, we want to foster. There's work to be done because there are other law enforcement agencies in this county that we need to reach out to and develop similar relationships with. We want to develop and explore appropriate opportunities for policy level engagement for the DA's office. I'm not sure exactly how that looks, but we want to explore appropriate opportunities for us to get involved in some of the policy level discussions that impact on the use of officer-involved use of force in shootings. We want to implement strategies that will allow us to build greater trust and confidence with you, with law enforcement, and I think that one of the ways that we do that is by submitting ourselves to your public appraisal. And once we build up a body of work that you're able to access, I think it will allow us to build a better means of communicating with one another. Okay. So let's go over some of the key policy changes that we've implemented. The first one you've heard about already. It involves the presentation of cases. We proceed on a case-by-case basis. In those cases that we decide not to present to the grand jury, we issue written declination letters on. The second thing is that we've instituted, and this is the first that I believe this has been used in Texas, we now use a special grand jury. Back in April, we impaneled a special grand jury, and that grand jury's purpose is to hear only use of force cases, not just officer-involved cases, but only use of force cases. Another thing that we did was I requested permission from the impaneling judge to allow us to do a voir dire examination in front of that panel. I think that that was useful because it helped us to address and identify grand jurors that if they thought that there was a case that needed to be indicted, that all of the cultural and social constraints that might make them reluctant to return an indictment, we could go ahead and address. One of the other things that we have been doing is in our orientation process. I think the young man one of the young men in the back, during our orientation process, I think I was able to meet with his family. What we've tried to do in our orientation process is balance it. We allow the grand jurors to hear not only from APD, their training officers, or an officer who's been through the process, but we also allow them now to hear from families who've lost loved ones in officer-involved shootings. Again, the idea is to impress upon the grand jury the importance of the decision that they'll be called upon to make, so that if they believe a crime has been committed, they will return an indictment. We've talked about published policies, procedures, and protocols. We will be having public forums. We are engaged in and have been proactive in our investigations. So not only does APD's SIU, Special Investigations Unit, conduct their investigation, but we have been actively involved in those investigations as well, either through requesting the lead detective assigned to that case to perform certain investigative tasks and functions, or independently seeking help to address forensic issues that we thought needed to be addressed. And we've done that in several cases up to this point, but we have been emphasizing our own independence as an investigative body, as well as continuing to nurture our relationship with SIU in monitoring their investigation process. And I've already mentioned to you all that family conferences have been and are a critical component of how we review and decide how to proceed on these cases. I'll briefly go over this. This is just simply a chart that outlines some of the differences in how our policies, how we're distinguished from some of our counterparts here in Texas. We are one of the only, well, there are a number of things. We're the only district attorney's office that seeks and uses a special grand jury to investigate officer-involved shooting cases. We're the only district attorney's office in Texas that issues written declination letters when we decide not to prosecute a case. We're the only one that has a formal process, not saying that other offices don't have outreach programs to families of folks who have been injured or killed in officer-involved shootings, but ours is a formal process of information sharing. And as we continue to move forward, there will be a much more formal program that allows us to serve as a conduit for the questions, comments, and criticisms that we get from families who we meet with. And then in the final column, District Attorney Moore has already mentioned this. One of the things that we do is if we decide to take a case to the grand jury, we take a position on the case, with the exception of a case where we believe there's just a legitimate investigative matter that needs to be addressed. But if it's a case where we've decided that we believe that there's evidence that indicates a crime has been committed, we take a position in front of that grand jury. Let me, in the interest of time, let me go quickly over the law. It's been mentioned several times what our role is. We have a very narrow function, and that function is to determine, based on the facts that have been disclosed in the investigation, whether or not we believe that a crime has occurred. In this context, that's a two-step process. First, the question is whether or not the conduct in the abstract that led to the person being injured or killed would constitute a crime if it's not justified. That's typically not where the issue is. The second question is whether or not whether the use of force in that case can be justified. There are three bases on which conduct can be justified in these officer-involved shooting cases. That is defense of self, defense of others, and then there's a general provision that allows law enforcement to use force in order to effectuate an arrest or a search. Let's go down here. The question about whether or not force, an instance of use of force is justified, really boils down to two inquiries. One relates to the necessity in that circumstance, and second, was the response proportionate? That is the sole issue that we focus on when we review the investigation facts to determine whether or not an instance of officer-involved shooting was justified. And this is important. I'd like you all to understand this, because I think we think that one of the things that will help us build trust and actually help us to be more effective in what we're trying to do is if we understand some of the tools that we work with and some of the limitations that are placed upon us. There are 3 bases in the law that allow for the use of force. One is in response to another's actual unlawful use of force. The second is the threat of an unlawful use of force. And the third is a reasonable apprehension of danger. That is, it's important that you understand under the law, even if there's no actual threat of danger, the law in some circumstances allows the use of force and even deadly force. And that may be an area for policy level discussions, but at the moment, that's what the law is, and we are limited by that law when we review the facts and circumstances of a particular case.
Run out of time here, so we're cutting short of the Professor Guilford, I think, does an excellent job. I failed to recognize another one of my assistant DAs, Megan Harding, the much better half of. This issue is critically important to a healthy community. I think part of when we talk about holding people accountable, you know, the criminal justice system is a very limited tool. Good defense lawyers, you know, find ways to defend their clients, and it's a system that's designed to be adversarial and a very thorough process. There is a spectrum of behavior here, not all of which the criminal justice system can or should address. There are places where the criminal justice system intersects with bigger societal problems, and it's a very unsatisfactory intersection to everyone involved. We've talked about mental health issues. I didn't calculate it, but I'd say 2/3 of the incidents we've seen on my watch are incidents that are directly related to a mental health problem on the part of the decedent. This community is not addressing mental health problems before they get to the point where officers are placed in absolutely impossible positions. And we, Dexter, Laurie, and I have already spent in our 7 months here hours talking about that. So when we talk about collaborating with other agencies and other governments, and when we talk about the limitations that we face, it happens there. If we can foster a bigger dialogue, then we will serve all of you better. So we recognize a role in that. But we also want you to understand that when it comes to the use of the criminal justice system, that's a limited tool. And right now, I'd say it's a very unsatisfactory tool in most of these instances. And I think the police department would stand right up with me and say that. So I hope that is helpful, and I hope that gives you some insight into what we're doing. All of the written declinations have not started yet. We had all the intentions in the world of having some of those published before tonight, but we inherited a backlog, and we also had seven incidents take place. So we've been struggling, and they did present 2 cases to this grand jury that resulted in indictment. So, you know, we are busy. I think that bodes a future where we will be asking people like Commissioner Trevelyan to consider expanding our resources for this purpose. And I hope the community sees that that's a good investment.